are unfamiliar with Zoom, and it would be hard to believe that anyone's unfamiliar with Zoom at this point, we do try to make the most of using the chat, which you'll find on the screen, and you can follow the questions. You know, if you want to ask a question, if you want to respond, you want to share something, that's a great place to do it, because we're hoping to elicit a conversation. These are conversations of consequence, and this is part of the fiber of Anshe Emet, is to have conversations, thoughtful conversations, and even hard conversations, to not always come to a point of agreement, but to come to deeper understanding, and to open ourselves up to different points of view, and to remind ourselves that we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that the only way for us to learn is not to simply review what we already know or what we already think, but to stretch ourselves and to engage. So that's our purpose this evening. And I'm really so glad that so many of you are making time to join us for what I think is truly a conversation of consequence. Tonight, we're going to meet some extraordinary people. And we're going to hear about a remarkable program called ConTextos. And let me just frame this, because I'm a rabbi, in terms of our weekly Torah reading. We're reading from the book of Deuteronomy, and the portion is Re'eh, which means in Hebrew to see. And the portion begins, see, I put before you blessing and curse. Choose the blessing. And if you read the Torah reading, or you read the book of Deuteronomy, it seems very obvious what the choices are, what the blessing is, and what the curse is. But I would suggest to you that the understanding of blessings and curses may change depending on your perspective. What may seem patently obvious in one context may not be in another context. And we are, in a sense, in a very real way, going through a very challenging period in American life. And we have yet to come together. In fact, it feels like we're becoming more and more divided. And it's only through conversations like this that we're going to find our way, only through opening ourselves up, and also to have the courage to suspend what you think you know from your reality, and open yourselves up, and we should all open ourselves up to hearing other realities, other viewpoints, so that we can find our way together. So let me tell you a little bit about ConTextos, and I'll read from its mission statement. ConTextos uses the power of personal narrative to promote healing and reflection, and to foster critical thinking and dialogue. ConTextos seeks to lift up the voices and insights of people affected by trauma, to challenge assumptions, and to provoke change. The ConTextos Author Circle is a healing-centered, co-created space that uses writing, reading, and engaged dialogue as vehicles for transformation. ConTextos provides the opportunity for people affected by violence to write and publish their personal stories in order to heal as individuals, families, and communities, to build empathy and change assumptions, and to author a new story of Chicago that lifts all voices. ConTextos is the vision of Debra Gittler, who is, I think, a Chicago hero. In 2011, Debra, with limited funding, but ever ambitious goal to transform the learning experiences for young people in El Salvador's most ignored and under-resourced communities. Since then, since 2011, Debra has raised over $5 million and expanded ConTextos' reach into Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and in 2016, into Chicago, Illinois. Under Debra's leadership, ConTextos has carved a unique niche at the intersection of education and justice reform to lift up the voices and support the social, emotional learning of young and youngish people living in some of the most violent and trauma-prone contexts of the Americas. Debra hails from New York City. She was a bilingual teacher in a previous life in the Bronx. She moved to Honduras, where she taught literature and language arts in a small school. And from Honduras, she was recruited to be the coordinator and lead author of El Salvador's National Teacher Training Strategy in Literacy Instruction, part of a regional Latin America reform strategy to improve the quality of education funded by U.S. aid in conjunction with the Ministry of Education. Welcome, Debra. And I also want to acknowledge Shulie Weinberg, who's with us, because really it's through Shulie, who grew up at Anshe Emet and whose family has a long history at Anshe Emet. It's through Shulie that I came to know a little bit about ConTextos, and I was so inspired by her story and what she was and her passion that we wanted to put this program together this evening. And I also want to acknowledge that we're going to get a chance to hear from two extraordinary members of ConTextos, Johnny Page, who's the co-director of programs and partnerships, and Darrius McCarty, authors circle facilitator. But that'll be a little bit later. For now, welcome, Debra, and welcome, Shulie, as we begin our conversation. ConTextos is an unusual name. Can you tell us the story of your organization and how you got to work, how you do the work you currently do in Chicago?
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you guys all for being here. It's so exciting to see so many people that I know and so many people that I look forward to knowing. So as you mentioned briefly, the work that we do here in Chicago actually started in El Salvador. I am not from New York. My father's from New York. I am from Hyde Park, proudly South Side Chicago. And so after college, I went to college where Amy went to college. I went to University of Michigan and then became a teacher in the South Bronx. I've spoken Spanish my whole life. I was a bilingual teacher. I wanted to live abroad. And I ended up working at a small school in rural Honduras that had a mission that I believed in, which was namely to work with kids that needed a good teacher. I didn't go into education just to educate. I wanted to be able to teach kids that I thought deserved to have an education like what I had. And then from there, I ended up working in El Salvador in very traditional education reform programs funded by USAID, the World Bank, tens of millions of dollars to motivate reform. El Salvador at that point was a post-war country. It still is a post-war country. And my job was to try to retrain teachers to promote critical thinking in students. So in Spanish, the word for literacy is alfabetización, which means to alphabetize. And the idea that once you know your letters and you can ma, me, mi, mo, mu, you are literate. And so our work was around trying to change that concept, right? That literacy is not actually just the reading and the writing part, it's the thinking that happens around it. And I tell two versions of the story of how that turned into ConTextos. One is that I was so inspired by that work, but the reality is I was so disheartened by that work to see all of the money and resources that were going to try to change and uplift people's lives. And, change wasn't happening. Young people, we were spending the money, but young people's experience was not changing. They were still learning through rote memorization and copy, even 3 years after we had, gone deep into this work. And that's when I left El Salvador, I ended up going back to school and started the organization that is now ConTextos. And so when we came back into El Salvador a year later, so this is in 2011, and I want to shout out my board chair, Tony Barash, who I met while I was at Harvard in graduate school designing the program that's ConTextos. And he was really such a motivating force to convince me that to start something out of scratch, to start something from nothing was not only possible, but an opportunity and an obligation. So when we started with the intent purpose of trying to help young people read and write in ways that were meaningful. So a lot of work around reading aloud, and we're training teachers about how to read aloud. In the first year, we really didn't do anything right. We set up school libraries. We created incredible private sector partnerships. We had all of the things on paper that looked like it should be enough to change the experience that young people were having in schools. But, and I don't know how many of you guys have heard anything about El Salvador. You tend to hear about it a lot right now because of the MS-13 and issues at the United States border, but gang violence is an incredibly palpable and ubiquitous issue in that country. The trauma and the legacy of war, of colonialism, of migration, and now of transnational gangs. And what we kept finding is that no matter what we were doing in our work, powerful learning environments happened when young people could show up as their whole selves and share their whole stories. And that's really where the work that ConTextos does was born. So the name ConTextos means context, but it also means with text. And the idea that text only makes sense in context. What you read only has meaning based on what you know and what you've experienced and who you're sharing it with. And that from, as we know, readers, passionate readers have a natural instinct to become writers. So that's the work that ConTextos was born out of. We started in schools. We started mostly working K through 3 and then grew to K through 6. And then when we saw the profound shift in the work from our students as readers to become writers, it was when it was actually the United States State Department internationally. They asked us if we would be willing to go into schools in what were considered recruitment zones in El Salvador. So the areas where the gang violence was the strongest. And that's where we went in and we launched Soy Autor, which in English we call Author Circle, which was the first program that directly targeted writing as a way to both channel experiences and emotions and build academic skills working with young people at high school level. And then what we found out in that process was that all of the assumptions that we came in about working in schools with young people who are living in these violent areas were incorrect. We assumed a lot about the young people and their communities, and their stories over and over taught us differently. So not only was the storytelling process so powerful and young people started opening up about their experiences, and their experiences living in daily violence was much different than what one might assume, but that work, sharing those stories, actually built bridges. All of these people who would never be invited into these communities were hearing stories, and they were becoming more curious and more brave to engage. And so from there,
Debra, before we move on, let me just stop you for a second. Give us an example of what you mean when you say that our assumptions, or the assumptions that you were making, were changed when you began to read what other people were writing. Give us an example of what that means.
I'll give you a few. One in particular is, and I was, very guilty of this. I had the idea that young people made a choice about joining a gang. And that part of our job would be to fertilize, strengthen them so that they would make a better choice. And through this work, what I learned is that very few of them made any choice. The environment they grew in was a label that was theirs, whether or not they chose it. Just like, I'm from Hyde Park, whether or not I want to be from there, that is where I grew up and lived. And so the decision to either accept that label or reject it was a decision that had incredible consequences for young people. You either made friends or enemies. And so the idea that at any time our work should directly address that versus embrace and understand it, that was one huge learning. The other thing was just the sheer number of the young people we were working with. And I think the first pilot was only about 40 kids, but how many of them had physically walked to the United States and back? How many of them had had experience of going home and looking for their mother or their brother and waiting months until a phone call came to find out where they were, which was far away. And then also that, the violence that was existing around them that I read about in the newspaper every day was horrific. And very little was that what they wrote about. They wrote about the people that they missed. They wrote about their moms and dads and their little brothers. They basically wrote about what I would write about, the people that they had lost and the people that they had grieved, but not the sensational bloodshed that we tend to see in the headlines. It was human and humane. Those stories were easy to empathize with. I lost a sister when I was young to random, in a car accident. And the number of young people that were sharing stories of just their grief, not why somebody died, not how somebody died, just that they had lost. That built bridges in ways that we didn't anticipate.
It's very powerful. Can I just I don't want to interrupt your flow because I know you want to get to how you got to Chicago and all of that, but I do want to ask Shulie how you got involved and what drew you to ConTextos.
Hi, yeah. Well, I just graduated Barnard College back in May, and my graduation plans were a little thrown out of whack because of COVID. But I've known about ConTextos for a little while. My mom has been involved, and she's been participating in the cyber writer circles that started in March as a way for everyone to keep meeting during the pandemic. And I've always been interested in kind of the work ConTextos is doing, and I've been working with them since June. And, you know, during the time of COVID and all this civil unrest happening in Chicago, the work has just been obviously really powerful, as Debra's going to continue to talk about, and talking with her and the rest of the ConTextos team, and also conversations I've been having with my family just about our role and just learning more about what's happening in the city. These powerful conversations have just been, I guess, a personal endeavor as well as kind of, I think, as a Chicagoan, something I feel obligated to help out with.
It's amazing that you're doing it. Tell us one thing you've learned since May that you didn't know.
I'm putting on the spot here. Well, I think Chicago is an incredibly complex city. And, you know, I feel like as much of a Chicagoan that I feel, I think there's a lot about the city and the people in it that I don't know. And so I've gotten the chance to read a couple of the pieces of poetry and fictional writing that has come out of the cohorts, and actually work on publishing a series of publications from the Cook County Jail Writers Cohort, which if someone could drop a link, I can. I encourage everyone to read, and I think it's just really, really important to know that, you know, these statistics that we probably read all the time in the newspapers, there's stories and there's people and their faces behind that. Behind, you know, one event, you know, that you hear in the weekend, there's a whole kind of a trauma scene, as a ConTextos writer wrote a few weeks ago, of kind of the impact that, again, like we can just generalize a shooting so as just, oh, another one, but there's a lot more kind of beyond that.
Right, so you've learned to read beyond the headlines.
Yeah, and I think just reading the work, the personal
Faces.
stories,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
The personal stories, I think, are crucial, again, because you can't generalize. And they're really, you know, obviously very in-depth, personal, vulnerable stories.
So, Debra, how does ConTextos speak to you as a Jew? Does it speak to your Jewish values in any way? I mean, do you feel like this was also part of the motivating force for you to get involved on this level?
Absolutely. I mean, one, you know, Passover is why I'm Jewish. That's what I identify most, you know, that liberty is an obligation. That was, you know, that's what my home was based on. But I think when I started traveling the world, and I learned that stories were tools for us to see each other in the past and thus our future differently. And I learned that in Hebrew school. I learned that we read not so that we all have the same meaning, so that we can understand these complex layers of meaning and, you know, consistently and constantly through generations navigate through that. And so to be in a place where reading was only one way of reading, there was only one meaning, it was mame, mimomu, and sounds. That was so not what I understood as reading and writing, and I connect that very much to my Jewishness. And the other thing is, I think profoundly working in environments with so much loss, my Jewish upbringing was never forget. You know, even stories of the Holocaust and stories of so many other moments of, you know, the most difficult times, and learning how our people overcame them. And to be in El Salvador, where first war and then, you know, street violence that killed so far many more, and there are no names to remember. It is just to forget. And El Salvador's official peace treaty, which is the first official peace treaty that was negotiated by the United Nations, was basically a forgive and forget policy. Rather than hold people accountable for war crimes, let's forgive and move on, you know, forget and move on. So names were not remembered, atrocities were not remembered, and that was so totally foreign to what I understood that healing and empowerment meant. And so as our work grew into incarceration systems and detention systems and deportation systems and community-based reentry, those two tenets have stuck with me so meaningfully. And then, I think especially during COVID, one thing that happened for me is, Friday night and Shabbat, which is a practice I've enjoyed, and I've used Shabbat as ways to bring together my diverse communities, internationally and here in Chicago. Shabbat as a moment to pause, especially while we're all working at home, and separate the work week from my rest. During shelter in place, that was a remarkable experience. It brought me incredible peace. And then, in late May and early June, when we saw a shift around civil unrest, I started holding space with people I love on the south and west sides of Chicago, because Friday was a time to wait and keep our fingers crossed and hope for a decent weekend.
Right. So you used the word hope, and I was thinking that would be part of that Jewish context, if you will, because I think that part of being Jewish is to continue to be hopeful and to build a more hopeful future. But it's in Chicago right now, it's getting harder to be hopeful. Whether it's the violence that we're seeing, the unrest, the tension with police. How do you see ConTextos playing a role here to bring us to a more hopeful place?
I'm really happy my colleagues Darrius and Johnny are here to help answer that question. So for me, when you look at the statistics and the headlines and the numbers, it is incredibly difficult to find hope. But as you hear individual stories and you meet individual people and their names, it's easy to believe in people. And so the work that we're doing, when shelter in place happened and we had to stop most of our programming in jail, but our community-based work and all over the south and west sides went to digital, and we started launching new digital spaces for sharing. What we found is that hope doesn't exist isolated. We need each other to hope. And we need each other to share grief, and the reality that I've worked in environments where people have dealt with long-time trauma, but I didn't experience or share it. And now is a time where we're all experiencing and sharing it. And the only way I think that we can find hope for any place in our city is if we, understand that we're in it together, and that the grief and the loss and the compounded feeling, right, this echo chamber that we can't escape. I think it creates a lot more empathy to understand communities on the south and west sides, what they've been going through for years. And also it creates an urgency for us to figure out how to find hope in each other. I mean, I can share specific stories of young people I've worked with, and I know their headlines. I can't lie, I work with young men who have done some pretty difficult things to understand. But it sort of goes back to those young people in El Salvador who I had assumed were making choices or making bad choices. But here in Chicago, so many of the people that we work with, they're not making bad choices at all. They're making the best choice they can given the opportunities available to them. So, I mean, I can't naively say that hope is easy to find, but it's the only thing that we can rely on.
Mm-hmm. And the empowerment that's in our own hands to create change. And let me just put another word in here that's going to become much more a part of our context as we go forward, and that's the idea of tshuva, that we can change the course of our lives. We can return not only to the best of ourselves, but we can also return to what we believe is the best society that we can create. That hopefulness is so much a part, I think, of the Jewish vision, and I really feel that, and I see that in you as you speak. That we are on the road, not at a dead end. We just need to figure out what our next steps are and how to go there together. And I think our stories help us bind ourselves to one another as we go forward.
I think if anything, my Jewish faith has told me that the worst moments don't define our resilience. It's what we do after them. Mm-hmm. So for so many of the people we work with, and Darrius and Johnny, I invite you to, help share those stories, but we often meet them at many of their worst moments, and to see them as they're coming out of that, we call every participant an author. And as the rabbi said, an author circle, we create spaces for vulnerability and sharing. So over months, working with young people who really haven't had an opportunity to be vulnerable together. And many of their stories, sometimes because it's so quotidian, they don't share it. Sometimes just because it's so much, they don't share them. But as they start to tell their stories and build on their stories, my observation anyway is, shame turns to pride. And then the process of publishing, and their final works are published books. They're illustrated books. Sometimes they're compilations. And now during COVID, they're these beautiful digital published multimedia works. Yeah, those stories, I'm going to share a story of one that's probably the most motivating to me, or one of them is a young man who had gone out with his brother in his early 20s, and they were downtown together. He dropped his brother off at home. And before he had pulled away, he saw his brother get shot and lay on the ground, and he went to him and waited for the police to come. And when the police did, they pushed him away from his brother, and his brother ultimately died. And the next day, as he is in mourning in his home with his family, the author, his friends came to get him, and he thought they were going to go to retaliate and avenge his brother's death. And instead, his friends turned against him and shot him. And so I've gotten to know this man coming out of that, right? His whole world fell apart in grief and in loss and in despair and in a lack of trust. And during Circle, he told that story. And it was one of the first times he told that story. He wrote that story. He wept for that story. But the story that he published was the story of his big brother and how his big brother taught him how to ride a bicycle. That's the story he needs the world to know, right? Not the story of the gangster or of the bloodshed, but the story of his big brother who was his hero.
So how do you get people to get involved with ConTextos? How do you reach out to people? How do you connect? I guess I'm interested to know how Johnny and Darrius got involved.
I could jump in on that one. My name Darrius. Everybody, thanks for having us here. I'm an author, circle facilitator at ConTextos, and I was introduced to ConTextos by a friend of mine, Emmanuel Andre, who was a very prestige attorney. Emmanuel asked me to join our 2 p.m. call, what has grown to be our Cyber Circle 2 p.m. call. And, I joined as a participant, just writing and telling stories. And just a few short months later after I joined, a few short weeks after I joined, Debra and Johnny and Lisa, they asked me to work for ConTextos as an author to facilitate. And that's part of what I always loved about ConTextos, because I just came to join, as a participant, and little did I know, a few weeks later I got hired on. And that's big to me, because it's a lot of people talk about doing the work out here, and they even throw money people away, but I'm a person who's been through a lot of different levels of trauma, and they hired me on the team, so it's they invited me to be family, not to just work with me as an author, or I'm on the team, I work, like Debra said, I'm a colleague, and I was honestly just getting out of prison, I was on house arrest when I got hired on, so it was they gave me the opportunity, so they creating real opportunities for people.
Mm-hmm. So I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about your work in the jails and the community, and just so help us understand the work that you're doing, and how you approach people and how you help them to begin to write.
Okay, so I'll talk a bit about that, because I spend most of my time in the jail doing the work, and so it's an interesting process, right? So typically what happens is we don't generally choose the folks who come to Author Circle inside Cook County. They're chosen based on their request. So they ask to participate in programming, and then they give us 2 groups of 15, 30, roughly 30 men inside the jail, and then we begin to work with them. It's always interesting. Each circle is different. Each bring something different to the space, and in that space, what we do is we focus on 5 major things: drafting, revising, editing, illustration, and publishing, right? And so it's a gradual process. So when we walk in, the first thing we tell them, this is not English class, right? So it's about you sharing your story, not you being taught the canon, right? Not you being taught what classical English is, right? It's about you telling your story in the way that you tell your story, the way that it best supports you in the moment that you're in. And so from that process, we start with these small things we call story seeds. And out of these story seeds, they pick one or two or three, and they start to draft. And then once they settle on a story, then we start talking about revision, editing, publishing, and going through the entire process. The author circle itself is based on a few key principles, what we call author circle values. And so when we come in, each individual is sort of asked to sort of identify a value that they think will be difficult for them and one that they think is very important for the space. And so author circle values are things like be brave, keep an open mind, expand your comfort zone, collaborate, seek diverse perspectives, stop, think, feel, ask for help, share and receive feedback, be candid, embrace your growth, embrace your truth. And so in that process, they pick something that identifies with them or what they may think is difficult. So it's a collective process. Author circle facilitators are just as a part of the circle as the men that we facilitate with, right? So we're not there as the sort of the teacher in the room. We're not there as the authority in the room. We're having a shared space where we all share and where we all collaborate together to create the work that comes out.
So it's like you're facilitators as opposed to being a teacher. So give us an example of some of the seeds, like some of the seeds that you're going to spur someone to begin to write with Johnny.
So we don't give them the seeds. We get them to think about. So when they come up with their own story seeds, right? So it may be So memoir writing is about slices of moments in your life, right? And so one may talk about the birth of a child, right? So you see a lot of that. A lot of the men talk about their children. So how the birth of their child, or finding out that their girlfriend or wife or whomever was pregnant, and what that felt like, and how did that motivate a change? And then they'll tell the story of the birth of their child. Others will talk about the death of a loved one, the death of a friend, or first day of school. So story seeds can be anything that gets at the stories that, not the stories that we tell every day, but what we call unfinished business, the stuff that we don't get an opportunity to talk about, the things we don't get an opportunity to share.
Mm-hmm. And this process is transformative.
Oh, the process is definitely transformative. So at the end, you'll see the books, and right. So I hope you all have opportunity to go and check out our website and look at the actual work of the authors over the years, whether it be El Salvador or Cook County or the communities in Chicago. That's one thing, right? And that's to enlighten us as individuals in society and the greater community. But the process that the men go through, that shared bonding, the finding out that you're not alone, right? That you're not by yourself. You know, oftentimes we think we're the only one suffering through something. And then to find out someone else is suffering through something similar or the same thing, it sort of empowers us. So one of the things you talked about earlier was hope. How do we find hope? And so when we talk about, for me, that hope comes out of that process, right? When you see somebody else go through something that you've been through or who've lived and experienced that you share, then that gives you hope that there's something on the other side.
So it's, you connect with one another in this process as well. Does it, and I'm picking up on Tikva's question, does this change people's behaviors? Does it change the trajectory of their lives?
Yeah, I want to jump in on that. So, Johnny talks about the work and who do we work with? So we say hurt people. So we work with people that we suspect have been hurt themselves, which means they're more likely to hurt somebody else, right? We know that most witnesses to violence will become victims of violence. And most perpetrators of violence were previously victims of violence. Hurt people, but stories also beget story. And so, you know, the story seeds that Johnny's talking about, every circle that we starts with shared reading together. And how does it change people's behavior is that for the first time, I don't want to say for the first time, but you see young people, you see individuals sharing and opening up in ways that they weren't. And when they publish, standing on stages and proudly as a published author sharing their work, and to change their behavior or be a better person, I would just say that I think that the language itself is difficult. So many of the individuals that I've learned, I work with, and you know, Darrius and Johnny, please follow up. When you hear about the situations they're in, oftentimes when I understand their story, I wouldn't have made any different choice. If I was in the environments, I mean, I think about Charles Woodhouse. He just published an op-ed in the Sun-Times a couple weeks ago. He was shot 21 times when he was 15 years old in front of his home. Nobody was ever held accountable for that. He was, you know, he wasn't given the physical help he needed, let alone the emotional support. And the fact that he started carrying a gun, that was not a great decision, but I wouldn't argue that it was a bad decision or he was a bad person. It makes a lot of sense in the environment that he was in and everything that he had experienced, that would be a rational choice for him to keep himself safe and keep the people around him safe. But in terms of behavioral change, I mean, we have authors right now in El Salvador. We have 4 of our authors who we met while they were incarcerated on our staff, which is, you know, exciting and incredible. But we have authors who we met who were detained in, you know, third world gang prisons that are now in college. One of them, you know, a couple of them have traveled internationally. So many of them commit their time and their work to continuing to work in their communities. But I think also the recognition that this isn't linear work. This isn't, you know, hurt people is also based on the idea that hurt people deserve opportunities for healing. And healing does not happen in a moment, right? I mean, healing happens over long periods of time and it's not always linear. So we would be lying to say 100% of our authors are great. But what they are is better prepared for what they're doing next, which is in their relationships with their children and their parents and their partners, in school and in learning. Most of the, you know, Darrius, I would love to hear what you have to say, Johnny, but I think that so much of what I've learned about this work is the judgment of, you know, that you are wrong and you need to be right versus what you have experienced has created a certain pathway, and how can we now create different pathways and different patterns? That's long work. And what we're seeing in Chicago right now for sure is that we have ignored this work for a long time, and now we really need to get down to it.
And so I want to add to that, right? So the question about better, and how do we, you know, better to whom, right? To the individual, I suspect, when we think about where we're at in Division 10 of Cook County Jail, prior to ConTextos coming in and dealing with what they call the most problematic part of the jail one of the most problematic parts of the jail at that time. And then that became the model for programming inside of the Cook County Jail, that actual division, which at once, you know, prior, you know, maybe less than a year before we came in, they had a hostage situation, and then it becomes one of the model program divisions inside of Cook County. So I mean, it depends on who you ask and how do you define better. As individuals, I think that for the first time, men are being seen, they're being heard, and they're being heard and seen in ways that don't reflect whatever the mistakes they have made at that moment, right? And so they're being seen and they're being heard. Maybe if they had been seen and heard prior to the mistake may have not have happened. We can't say with certainty. But what I do know is that what I see in the eyes of those men, I see something different. I see men who come into a circle, rivals, right, or not speaking to one another because of the boundaries set up based on affiliations with different groups, leaving that space the best friends, right, the best of buddies. And when we come back for alumni, these guys are hanging out, but they're from their opposition or options, they like to say, the language that they use, right? So it all depends on how we define what's better. But do I see an awakening in the men in there? Of course I do. Do I see an awareness in the men in there? Of course I do. So So by that definition, if we consider that better, then yes, I think the programming in itself and the opportunity to be seen and the opportunity to be heard, to be visible, makes them better.
You know, part of what I'm hearing is that, and this goes back to Debra's focus on the word context. In the context of the men that you're working with in their lives, they've been labeled every which way. And the larger society is contextualizing them in a pretty negative place. And what writing does is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is helps people discover their essence, what they're about, what they're feeling, and to be able to celebrate that and their own identity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Rabbi, you know, we work in Chicago now in Cook County Jail. We work in 5 different communities in workforce development and reentry programs. And we work with Chicago public school students who are both in school and outside of school. So 15-year-olds to 40-year-olds. And I think right now we tend to think that these individuals are so different because you're meeting them in a violence prevention program or in a school or in jail, and that somehow that makes them different. But what we've learned is that those individuals are carrying the same stories and the same hurt. Just because you happen to meet them in jail or in community, that's not the point of our work, right? I mean, Darrius, you've been running circles on the south and west sides all summer long. Darrius he's just started going in person in the last couple of weeks as the phases have allowed us to. Maybe you can speak a little to what you're seeing as you're working with young people who are in the mix and in the midst of the worst violence that our city has this summer.
It is real. Like, I'm gonna speak on Martha, you know, like when we first started, you know, online, it was kind of difficult because, you know, like everybody in their own space and stuff like that. But as we went along, like when you get to start sharing stories like about your personal life, about like me, I share a story about losing my little brother. Like, you know, I really like Debra said, we don't get emotional help like that where we from. We don't get therapists to talk to and stuff like that. So I never talked to nobody about this. This stuff that we hold in. Like, you know, I done lost my grandma, my aunties and uncles, like everybody I grew up with, on top of doing 7 years in prison and coming home to all this. So when you write this and you share this with somebody, you know, you like, you know, hold on to this. Don't just tell this to anybody. So when you're in a big circle and it's 20 guys and he's sharing about his brother, he's sharing about something that may happen to him, and he's sharing about a personal story. Like, you know, guys and share real, like, it's not all about violence. You know, people that shared about, like, you know, just it's all type of stuff. It's more to it than gun violence. Like, you know, in the world, you know, it's a lot of stuff going on, you know. You said what, Johnny?
It's those stories that you talk about, right? Well, the thing that we talked about, the stories that we don't often typically have the opportunity to share, right? So you're in a space where here it is, you walk in and you're fully clothed. You come in, a guy comes in and you can watch him. He's gonna come in and he has everything on because he don't know these people. He come in, I don't know if you remember, you know, the old Eskimo coats where they called them Eskimo coats where you zip all the way up to the face and you can just look out the little hole, right? But that's how they come in. They come in bundled up. And when they leave out like they're going to the beach, right? So they've shed all this other stuff because they've opened up and they've shared a space, a part of themselves with other people, right? And so for us,
answer the question in the chat. It was a real good question. She said, "Do we teach values at the same time, like when we listen to the stories?"
Of course. So yeah, I mean, so we start with values. So the author circle has values, and we use these, and those values are what we use to guide us throughout, right? So folks, so one of the things when we talk about language, right? If I ask you to leave your comfort zone, that's scary, right? And so we just change the word. We say expand your comfort zone. We're not asking you to leave it. We're just saying open it up a little bit and allow some different things in. And so, and that's expanding your comfort zone is a value you take with you throughout the rest of your day, week, year. Then that's something that you learn that allows you to invite folks in and to allow people to break beyond some of those barriers that you put up because as a protective measure, right? And so from a personal story, personal narratives, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I just wrote in is that we don't teach values, we live those values in circle, right? So people get mad. I've definitely seen a lot of people cry. I've seen people fight, but it's not what happens in those moments, what happens after those moments. I certainly knowing authors while they're in circle and their trajectories and years after, there are mistakes made, people move backwards, but what do we do in those moments? Those are how we live the values. The people that we get to work with, and I'll say this, I went to lab school on the South Side. I got to go to University of Michigan for college. I got to go to Harvard for graduate school. And I have never been in a more privileged place of learning than in some of the environments within Cook County Jail or prison in El Salvador or church basements on the West Side.
When you say privileged places of learning, what does that mean? Help us understand what you were thinking when you said that.
I think that the whole, and coming back to my Jewish values, I was blessed and lucky to come in with, all of this support and family and thousands of years of tradition to stand on. And then my resilience, my vision, my focus, my safety net came from that. To be in spaces where none of that exists and see the absolute human resilience, stories that are very much like my own, but there was not a large extended family and religious leadership maybe, or, a great school to hold me. The amount that so many of the young people that we're working with in Chicago, and Darrius mentioned Ma'afa on the West Side, the sheer weight of the constant tragedy and loss, right? When we think about just this summer, one of the programs we work with on the South Side, of their 25 participants, they've had 4 murders this summer. We could talk about why or what's wrong. At the end of the day, that much grief and trauma and loss and anger in such a short period of time right now, to be able to share that, because nothing in my life said that I had to share it or I had to see it. And I guess one of the things I think about is, I grew up in Hyde Park and I'm the youngest of 5. My mom and I had a conversation recently and she said, we could have afforded to leave. And I said, no, Mom, we could afford to stay, right? That's what the privilege is. The privilege isn't that, I don't have to be, I'm here just, because the privilege is the opportunity to be in a place that you don't have to be in. And so for me, these experiences, like that's what this privilege has done. It's allowed me into these spaces. Johnny talked about going into Division 10. When I met Sheriff Dart here, I think he said something like, well, if it works in a third world prison, it has to work in Chicago, right? And we went into an area where these young people were considered too violent and they're locked in cages. How do you think a human being is going to react when they have this much, grief and loss? And so for me to be in those spaces, and as Johnny mentioned, it's a shared space where my humanity is just as equal as everybody else's, where my loss is just as meaningful, where my struggle as a parent is seen just eye to eye. It's been humbling and overwhelming, and there's no place that I feel luckier to have been invited in, mostly because I never had to be there, right?
So powerful. I want to make sure that in our last 10 minutes that we can come back to the title. Hurting people hurt people. And I can't help but think that so much of the work is about healing the hurt. Do you want to talk about that as well? I mean, because I can't think of anything more urgent in Chicago right now than healing. And there's no magic to this. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Oh, definitely. So can I jump in? I'm sorry.
Johnny, I want you to. Thank you.
Oh yeah. So
these people don't want to listen to me. They want to listen to you.
All right. So it's the hurt. So I think about it in the sense of, right, we say hurt people, and I say it's the hurt that hurt produces, right? And so when we think about hurt and we think about healing, folks are more than their trauma, right? So just my story, just a brief. So when we talk about context, when I walk into a space, I may dress, I might even have the swag of some of the young people that we work with, but they see me as an outsider until they hear my story, right? So there's a context, right? So I grew up on the South Side. I'm a college graduate, right? But I spent 20 plus years in prison. So if I don't tell you that, you don't know that, right? So I come in as a director of a program, and then they see something different. they see the possibility. So that hope, when we talk about hope, that light bulb comes on, right? The possibility of what I can be beyond where I'm at right now, right? And so healing is a part, the process of healing is what we go through in that process. So even like, it's one particular story that I think about all the time is a brother talked about, he never got over his mother giving him to his grandmother, right? And so everything he did was for his mother to see him. And so he wrote about that, right? And that was the first time in his 38 years on the planet that he had even acknowledged that he was hurt about his mother leaving him with his grandmother. But the process of healing came out of that. And so it allowed him to have a better relationship with his own children, right? And so we even work with some of his children now in the community, which is just totally blows me away. And they have some of the same resentment, right, that he may have had because he went away to jail, right? And so it's a cycle. But when we talk about what we have to think about is the process, and we have to think about healing. People are more than their trauma. We can keep focusing on the things that brought us here, but we need to focus on the things that helps us heal from the things that brought us here, right? Our scars remind us of where we've been. They shouldn't dictate where we go. They just remind us of where we've been. And so, but what happens is, folks are constantly, those scars are like, people keep pointing to the scar. When I'm saying, I'm more than that scar. I got back on that bike after I bust my knee, right? I got back on it. So celebrate the fact that I learned to ride that bike and that I'm riding this bike comfortably than the fact that I fell off and I hurt myself so bad that I had to get stitches in my knee. So I'm more than that trauma. And so when we talk, and then when we talk about trauma, we have to talk about not just healing for the individual, but the healing for the community. Debra just talked about four young men being killed from one program. So it's 25 people in that program. So that's 21 other folks, not the family, but the 21 other folks that were connected to them. How do we help them heal? Right? We go directly to individuals, but when a person is hurt, he's not the only one, and she's not the only one that's hurt. It's everything that surrounds that's in that ecosystem that lives or comes in contact with that individual who was a witness to that individual's trauma. All of them are hurt by it. And so we have to focus on healing, and healing starts with acknowledgement, and acknowledging where we were hurt, how we were hurt, and how do we move forward. And for me, Author Circle helps us. It allows us to do that. I go to Author Circle. I need Author Circle just as much as the folks that we go to that I facilitate with. I'm in 10 circles because I need to be in every circle, because there's something that every circle I heal a little bit more. Right? Every circle focuses on healing. When I learn something about myself, when I learn something about others.
I want to respond to these questions because I think, Tikva, your question, this is to me, and I know Darrius and Johnny, I bring up the question that I think white people ask when Black people aren't in the room. And I certainly know my Jewish relatives have asked the question, right? Why are we okay and they're not? So one thing I think is important to think about is Jews after the Holocaust had reparations. Right? There were ways to help fix that. There were ways to help make sure that the Jews could get back on their feet. And so if we want to think about institutional racism and historic racism in the United States, I think absolutely we have an obligation, not just to reflect on 1968 and how we marched across a bridge with Martin Luther King. I'm proud of that moment. I'm proud there was a rabbi there, but we know a lot about how as a people we can get up and stand stronger. And I think we have an obligation and an opportunity to help the other people in our city right now.
And we have, I'm sorry, Deb, but we also have to think about narrative, right? So when we talk about why we lift up stories, because the narrative, right? The narrative is what allows why things are different for you than they are for me. The narrative, because the narrative says one thing about me and says something different about you. And because of the narrative, everything follows. Right, everything. So whether I live up to the narrative, right? Whether it's this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Folks saying this is who I am, and so I figure this is all I have. Right, all those things impact individuals. So I'm a believer of we have to change and challenge and complicate the narrative, right? So we can imagine better places. We can imagine a brave new world. We can imagine a brave new city. But we have to start by complicating and challenging the narrative, right? And we only do that if we lift up all the voices. We can't allow one person doesn't get to tell the story, because there's many sides to that story, right? So I have on the shirt, this is our shameless plug, but I'm the swag master for the organization. Until the lion learns to speak, until the lion learns to tell his own story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, right? And so until people have the opportunity to speak, then whatever's being said about them is going to be what the story is. And so we judge them based on that. Perception is reality.
I think also right now, I mean, right now more than ever, I've felt rage, fury, fear. I've cried so much over these last month or 6 weeks, and I have resources and family, and justice is on my side. And when I call the police, I know it's going to happen. And I still feel so seeped in, you know, this confusion, the uncertainty of this moment. And when I think about the work that I do in every environment, that uncertainty is ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. And so the idea, Rabbi, of healing, and the healing that we need to do. I know that I need to heal with my family just to get through these moments because they're brutal, but the healing that we need to do in our city, in every community. And I think the question isn't, you know, who's responsible for it, but how do we all become responsible for it? What we've seen in the last 48 hours, and it's twice this summer, there is no place in this city that is immune to what is happening. We are all responsible. We've all been carrying the hurt. And I think, you know, my grandparents were immigrants. They immigrated to Englewood. We gotta, you know, they left me with a lot. Mm-hmm. That to say the institutional wealth, you know, I like the quote, they left me with enough to do something, but not enough to do nothing. Mm-hmm. I look around my city and I think about like the healing and my Jewish values and what those opportunities are. And Tikva, you know, I had the same conversation with my family right after this first round of looting when my cousin said, why are they doing that and we didn't? And I think it's not a bad question. It's an important question, but I guess I'm asking myself, well, what do we do to help it stop? You know, I looked this morning and I thought, oh my goodness, only 35 people shot over the weekend. What a relief compared to what we've been going through. You know, now it's on Oak Street. We're hearing about businesses leaving. We know that Black and brown people in the United States have a different experience. You know, what we can do right now in Chicago, I think is urgent. I think it's requiring all of us to act. And I think the question of why, I guess it's easier for me to understand if I lived in Englewood or North Lawndale, and we're going to invite you guys to come see some of these places. Yeah. But if I was young in this moment right now, having grown up on the South or West sides, going to the public schools as they are, I don't know how I wouldn't be enraged and carrying a gun, because we have left young people with so little to look to. And the idea that if you don't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, I was given boots. I was given my boots to pull myself up with. And I think, you know, at this point, we have to recognize that that just isn't true across the board.
And remember, it's only a small, so we think about, when people talk about, like, they give all these numbers, right? Englewood isn't the worst place on earth, right? It's just not, there's a small group of individuals. So if you're on a block, if there's 10 families on a block, there may be two young people on a block that sort of participate in a level of, or put out the level of energy that creates the violence that we see. But the whole block is vilified, right? And so how do we have to think about, we have to see individuals versus seeing the collective, and then we have to see the collective, right? So it's complicated, but it's not, right? We have to be able, and people need to be able to say, man, you see me. When you see me, then you'll understand me. And if you understand me, then I can feel value in the conversation. If not, why do I need to talk to you?
Right. I want to make sure that, Darrius, you have a chance to talk as well, if you want to add anything to this conversation before we come to a conclusion.
Well, I will say that the work is important right now for so many reasons, but one main reason, you know, I would say is because it do give everybody a chance to tell their own story, because, you know, where we come from, you know, people really don't listen too much. So, you know, when you write what you write and write your story on paper, you know, you got the whole ConTextos organization listening. You know, we post it on the blog, you know, sometimes, you know, we have little work storytelling shops, you know, for people to hear. So, like, you know, when I write, and I used to write and stuff when I was in jail, it feel like I'm like, nobody gonna hear this. Like, don't nobody care. You know what I'm saying? So it's like when you publish a memoir or a book or a piece of poetry or anything, like, you know, it's getting heard. And I think that's real important. Getting a chance
So
to get
that's
out.
that is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Deborah, I think that there are many people at Anshe Emet who would like to get involved and like to know what they can do to be part of a solution for the city. So you want to talk to us a little bit about what we can do in this community and how we can partner with ConTextos?
Yeah. So first, on September 15th, as Darrius was saying, we have all of our storytelling events have become digital. So September 15th, we have a citywide storytelling event. It's Zoom just like this, and it is both current participants in our programs, graduated participants in our programs, and staff from across the city, all of the zip codes that are most affected by the violence that our city is seeing this summer. And I think if you want to hear stories beyond the headlines, it's an incredible opportunity to, even if it's a virtual space, share space with people that I probably, you know, we don't get to share space with. So that's one. The other thing is a relationship we have with the church on the west side. The church is Mount Pilgrim Church, and they run a program called the Ma'afa Redemption Project. It's a workforce development reentry program. Serves about 25 young men 18 to 24, most of whom have been at the crux of the criminal justice system or the violence in the city, meaning they have been in and out of incarceration, and many of them have been shot. Every single one of them has experienced the loss of gun violence in our city. And so we're doing a couple different things with them. One is that Rabbi and I have spoken about this idea of Friday night. Friday night continues to be such an important time for me, but with Pastor Hatch and his son Marshall and these participants of reentry, the opportunity to share space on a Friday night and understand and listen to a community that will, you know, talk about what Friday night is as a moment of pause when it's a moment of fear and waiting for what the weekend will bring.
So I've begun a conversation with Marshall Hatch Jr. and I'm hoping that if we can't get it together to have the interfaith service on the 21st, we are going to create an interfaith service with Anshe Emet and Pastor Hatch's church as well, and kind of begin this process of connecting.
And I just have to say, Rabbi, they are there's so many symbols they use that resonate so much around Judaism. Namely, we have a program with them. The program we run is called the Sankofa Stories. And Sankofa is an African concept, and it's a bird looking backwards. And the idea is that you can only move forward if you know what came before. So by looking back, we understand how to move forward. And we're working with them also to create what we're calling the Sankofa Story Garden. So taking empty space in their community and making it into a beautiful space for intergenerational sharing, you know, a place where we can tell stories. There will be a fire pit, there will be gardens. It's also going to be a space for the names of the people in their community who are lost, who they are grieving. So if you remember at the beginning of the summer, the 3-year-old boy who was killed, that's a child from their congregation. And, you know, so many of these questions are important, but I think, and this is what I've learned from Johnny and Darrius and all of our circles, my instinct was to judge before I just held space in grief. And I think that's what we can do right now, is create opportunities to hold space of faith and grief. I do think that Judaism is an incredible faith that, you know, is to be shared and to be learned from, not to be we know that, right? We don't need to inflict our beliefs on others, but when we welcome in and to let others share with what these thousands of years of learning has done for us. So there's a couple opportunities to be able to join us on the west side, either physically, maybe in COVID that's challenging, but certainly virtually. And definitely just, if you go through our website, there's incredible blogs written by young people all over the city. There's stories written by young people all over the city. You can see them in the newspapers now more and more regularly. But I would invite everybody to stay engaged with us. I know that Grace is putting some things on here, but proximity right now is something that I think we all need. And I will say that I think our young people would benefit as much from knowing you as you would from knowing them. You know, it is a lot easier to have compassion for a face and a human being than for a problem and a statistic.
We are, if you are, I'm speaking to the people in the Anshe Emet universe. If you are interested in ConTextos and you want to engage through the congregation, please let Amy know, please let me know, and we will make sure that that happens. I'm really excited about the possibilities of partnering, if we can, as we go forward. I think the work is, I know I speak for everyone when I say how important your work is, and the difference you're making and the healing that you're bringing. I think we're so grateful to Johnny and Darrius for sharing their stories and sharing their passion and sharing their experience with ConTextos. Again, Shulie, thank you for bringing this to my attention, and Susie Weinberg, thank you very, very much for the work that you've done. And I guess there was one question, I didn't want to let it slip, and I'm going to come back to Johnny for a second. Do the stories get shared within the community? In other words, is it just within the circle, or do people, how do the stories get out to the larger community, or do they?
Oh, of course. So we have, right, we have one author that we use his book as a teaching tool now, right? So when we go in different communities, we share the books. There's an actual website that you can go on and download the books. What is the name of it? I'm sorry, put it in the chat for me. It just slipped my mind. But yes, we share the books with community. We share them with law enforcement. We share them with schools. We share them with libraries. We share them with everywhere we work. We take those books. And so at issue.com, that's it. I'm sorry. So issuechicagoprojects.com. If you go on Issues, you can actually read the books. But we take those books and we share them. The families get the books. The authors, their families request multiple copies of the books so they can share it throughout the community. But yes, the books are shared everywhere and everywhere we go. So I've taken books all over this country.
And we have every event, every circle culminates at a publication event, and we have hundreds of people attend. And so their stories are recorded, they're said out loud. As Johnny mentioned, we've worked with law enforcement. We're still working with law enforcement. We train teachers, but just the way that hurt people, story begets story. So every circle, when we started, we used published memoirs. Now it's circles, it's stories from different circles that motivate new stories from new circles. And I included here a link, if you go to our website, for our Dear Chicago program. So you can see, we have a program with CPS students right now over the summer with Chicago Public School students, and just how they're creating platforms to share their stories, not just amongst themselves, but how they're putting that out into the whole world, not just for other students, but their pieces are actually teaching tools to train teachers, not train teachers about how to do author circle, but train teachers to understand what is it like to be a young person in their classroom.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing, but on a personal level, and I know that I speak for everyone, this has been remarkably uplifting, inspirational, and at a time that feels really challenging, very hopeful as well. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to other opportunities to engage with ConTextos. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, Barbara Citron.
Hey, everybody.
Thank you.